And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have William Kent Krueger on the show with me today. He has a phenomenal new project that I really love, and I know you're going to as well. If you followed my work, you know that Kent has been on the show a number of times in the past, and we've had some fantastic conversations. And when I saw that he had a new project and a different sort of project, I knew that we had to get him on and talk about it. So welcome to the show, Kent. How are you?
I am doing very well, Hank, and it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thank you. It's the same. I feel the same way. We were actually supposed to talk last week, I believe it was, but you got snowed in. There, you had some inclement weather where you were. I hope all that worked itself out.
Yeah, I was in Florida for a book event there, and was scheduled to fly back on Wednesday, but the snowpocalypse was predicted to hit. They were predicting up to 2 feet of snow. All flights were canceled, and so I had to spend another day in idyllic Florida. It was horrible, but I finally made it home. Yeah.
Well, that was a bit of culture shock going from warm, balmy Florida to snowpocalypse weather.
Hey, I have lived in Minnesota for more than 40 years. I'm used to this.
You're used to it, yeah, for sure. Well, we live in South Mississippi, and our weather's not a lot different than Florida. And I have coworkers that live in the mountains in Utah, and it's so funny, going back and forth. They're shoveling snow one day, and we have pine pollen, everywhere, and it's every place has their stuff, I guess.
There are good things and bad things no matter where you live.
100%, 100%. The thing about, living up north is you don't have to dodge hurricanes every year, but you do have to shovel snow. So there's,
Yeah,
you know,
we don't get hurricanes. We get fewer tornadoes than we used to have in the old days. But this year we really have been hit with one of the legendarily bad Minnesota winters, which
wow.
we haven't seen in quite a while.
Well, it's good to see the snow when you haven't seen a bunch of it, but it kind of grates on you after a while, I think.
Yeah, this is the first year I thought, maybe I should be a snowbird.
Yeah, right, right. Oh man. Well, Kent, you have a new project out, and this one is called The Levy, and it is it's new in a couple of senses. It's not in your O'Connor series. This is, with that series that we've grown to love and love following, this cast of characters and the amazing stories that you tell in that world. So this one is not in that world, and it takes place in the past. But also, excuse me, the distribution is a little different. This one is an audio original, and it's coming out only in audio for a selected time, and then I'm assuming will come out in print later down the road. Do I have the logistics of that right?
Well, there is nothing written in stone about it coming out in print farther down
Okay.
the road a piece. When Simon and Schuster picked up the project, they simply picked it up as an audiobook original, which was fitting with a direction they wanted to go. They are really invested in providing that audio experience for
Yeah.
people who love literature and for whom that's a reasonable way to access it. Um, Over the years, audiobooks have become more and more popular for a whole variety of reasons. So, and this is a novella, Hank,
Yeah.
which is kind of it's an odd length. Back in the old days when you had Life and so many other uh, magazine publications who would print a long short story or a novella,
Hmm.
you had a reasonable place for publishing, but they don't exist that way anymore. And to try to put out a novella, this was 130 pages, I think, in manuscript form on a shelf beside a full-sized book just doesn't work. So finding the right platform for offering this was important, and Simon and Schuster believed that this original audiobook was the way to go.
So was this a project that you had previous to Simon Schuster kind of pitching this idea? Like what came first? I guess I'm asking the opportunity to publish or the thing that needed to be published.
Hank, I took my first crack at writing the levy 50 years ago.
Really?
Yeah, when I was in my 20s, I read Faulkner's novella, The Old Man, which takes place during that great flood on the
Oh
Mississippi
yeah.
River back in the spring of 27. But for those of you in southern Mississippi, you probably are steeped in the history of that
Yes.
particular flood because you were horribly affected by it. At Memphis, during the height of the flood, the Mississippi River was 80 miles wide. So I read The Old Man, which is about a convict who is conscripted to try to save a pregnant woman trapped in this
Right.
flood. And I just loved the whole idea of that story. And so when I was in my 20s, I gave it a whack, didn't do such a good job of it, put it aside. Then I was taking a creative writing class in my 40s at the University of Minnesota, pulled that short story out of the cobwebs, dusted it off, and gave it another shot. It got a lot of approval by my colleagues in the class and the instructor, but they all had basically the same criticism. There's a richer, longer story uh, to be had here. So I put it back in my drawer of unpublished pieces. And during the pandemic, I wrote two full-length novel manuscripts. I wrote a couple of other novellas, and kind of was at the end of my rope in terms of ideas. So I opened that drawer, pulled out the levy, dusted it off, and completely rewrote the piece as it stands right now. So it has a long history before Simon and Schuster ever took a look at it.
I love that, and I love the idea that this was a project that you had previously written and really couldn't find a home for, because I talked to a lot of authors, and a lot of but the vast majority of authors have a story of having that trunk novel, that desk drawer novel that just didn't work for whatever reason, and they file it away and just start something brand new, and that is fascinating enough as it is, that someone would spend a huge chunk of their life working on a project. It doesn't work, so they just start all over again, just with a blank page. And, that's one thing that separates writers from other artists, that, will just start over and with no hopes that the next thing is going to work either, but you just take a crack at it. There's some psychology of writers. I don't know. I'm not qualified to dissect that, but I do find it interesting. Um
Every writer knows, Hank, you never throw anything away. At
right.
some point in time, you may decide, okay, I know how to write that story now. I understand the story better for whatever reason, and you pull it out of the mothballs and take another crack at it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But take a look at some of the great masterpieces in visual art. Experts know that under some of those great paintings are other paintings that
Right.
the artist simply wasn't happy with and painted over. So it's not just writers who do this.
S- was there something about this story that just, because like you said, there's nothing ever goes to waste. Either you find a way to rework that story, or you rob it for parts and you take a character out of this and plug it into another story, or there's something enchanting about a setting here that might work over here, and you kind of dissect it and use it. um but what was it about this story that lasted, that made you want to go back to it? There had to be a kernel of something that really resonated deeply with you.
Oh, absolutely. The whole idea of this enormous natural event, and there are some, frail human beings doing their best to battle that enormous flood has
Yeah.
always attracted me. That's a pretty classic story. And motivations. I always love to explore what are the motivations for people making what seem like inexplicably bad decisions. Uh,
Right.
and so I kept coming back to that. But what really kind of shifted everything for me, Hank, was all of the experience that in the intervening years I've had in writing crime fiction. And when I dusted this piece off, I realized I had put in place all of the elements for a really interesting, suspenseful kind of crime situation that I had never really explored. And so that really was the piece that fell into place that made this such a lot of fun to come back to and
Yeah.
rework.
Well, what's fun about this story to me is that there are um, crime novels that you love that are very visceral, and the crime is really kind of uh, just there on the page, and then you see how characters deal with the fallout of that, and all of that. But then there's a more subtle approach, which you do in the levy, and that there's we have people that have been involved in crime. We've got convicts, and then we have the feelings of fear and distrust that kind of permeate through this, and so it's not so visceral as some of your other stories, yet still as I'm grasping for words. It's still it's not as graphic and visceral, but still as emotionally present.
Yeah, that deep emotional, I hope, involvement on the part of the reader comes from everything that surrounds the criminal action that ends up taking place in this story.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that, and I don't know, maybe it's because of what I've learned as a storyteller, that that the criminal aspect of it seems to come suddenly out of the blue, not expecting it at all. And then it
Yeah.
adds, for me as the storyteller, it added this wonderfully rich, um, all these rich possibilities
Yeah.
for the
Texture.
story.
It adds texture to the
Exactly,
story.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so, in addition to this great flood that everybody's battling, suddenly there is another element that needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah. Um, at the risk of sounding ageist, because that's not what I'm trying to say here, but there are stunning novels that have been written by people barely out of their teens in their early 20s, and that are just emotionally rich, and
Yep.
the writers really
Yeah.
in connection with their whole being, and those things exist. I'm not saying that, um, but this is a story that you started trying to tell in your 20s, and as you said, 50 years later you finally tell the story. Was this a story that you personally needed to mature into, if that makes sense at all?
Yeah, it does, as a matter of fact. There are stories we would like to write when we're young because we think, "Ah, this will be a great story, a great story."
Right.
But in truth, we don't have an understanding of the world, of human nature, of all the complexities of human interaction that allow us to really explore that deeply and be able to create it in a believable way on the written page, or in this case, for the listener.
Right.
So I think you're absolutely right. I had to learn well, I had to learn who I was as a storyteller. That was a part of the journey. At 20 years of age, I had no idea what kind of a story I was able to write. Really, in the end, what kind of a story I wanted to write, and it took me a long time. I served a very long apprenticeship before I became a published author, Hank. Um, and it has stood me in good stead. So I don't think it's ageist at all. I think it's just the observation that so many of us, when I broke into the business, I had gray in my hair, what hair I had left at that point, um, and
Tell
uh,
me about it.
and so many of my colleagues also, when they finally made the move to either write their first piece or publish their first piece, had gray in their hair.
Yeah. You have spent the last uh, a lot of years working on Cork O'Connor
Mhm.
and writing his stories, and you've really crafted a world that is so much fun to just immerse ourselves into. Um, Stepping out of Cork's world and telling this story, what does I guess what I'm asking is, what does it do for you as a writer to change scenery sometimes, and to step out of the comfortable confines of the world and the characters that you've created?
You know, I, as writers, I think all of us need to think of ourselves as artists, and words are our medium. And if we really think of ourselves as artists, we always ought to be trying to grow in art. We ought to always trying to push our limitations. And so when I step away from the Cork O'Connor series, I'm able to paint on a broader canvas. I'm able to tackle issues, themes that I'm a little restricted in trying to address in my Cork O'Connor series. So I love the Levy for that reason. Different time, different place, different approach. And have loved my standalone novels, Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land, for exactly the same reason. And I think that those of us who write series, when we do something different, come back to this series feeling a little refreshed.
Yeah, it definitely did you find yourself when you step away from Cork's world, do you start kind of wondering, I wonder what's going on over there? You know, what what's going on in the frozen wasteland while I'm, down here floating on a flooded river?
While I'm at work on one of the other projects, I have to be truthful. I'm not really thinking much about Cork O'Connor. I really focus on Cork when it comes time to begin work on the next manuscript, for which I have a contractual obligation.
Yeah.
So I am working now on the next Cork O'Connor novel, which won't be released until the fall of 2024. And I'm aware that I've been away from it for a while, so I need to re-steep myself in the environment and the characters in order to really write believably again about Cork and everybody involved in the life there.
In the Levy, you mentioned that great Faulkner novel, The Old Man, and his telling of this happening. There have been a couple of other great novels that at least have a view into this event. I think John Grisham's The Painted House. Um, there's a flood there. Was it? I can't remember. If it was this flood or not. It's been several years since I read. Anyway, um,
It floods
there's
a lot
this.
in the South, apparently.
Well, yeah, we get a lot of rain and they're big rivers. That's going to happen from time to time. What was it about this that really captured your imagination? Because this was an event that not only affected the South, because the Mississippi River runs the entire length of the United States, just about, and these happenings started up north and all kind of flooded down. So it's not just something that happens in our world, but uh, but what was it about this singular event that was so captivating to you?
Well, the enormity of the event itself, and I knew about the flooding, that great flood on the Mississippi River, from the time I read Faulkner onward, and so it's been
Yeah,
an intriguing incident for me to think about, to contemplate, and particularly because I tried very early on to write a story about it. You know, it is an historical novel. I didn't live back in 1927, so I had to do an enormous amount of research just to get a sense of the extent of the flood and the damage that it had done. And so oh, Hank, I looked at so many photographs of the flood while it was happening and the devastation after it receded, and I was just blown away by the enormity of the catastrophe. Um, and I have always been interested in and sort of the whole question, and you see this in the Cork O'Connor novels all the time, which take place in the wilderness, of pitting uh, human beings against what nature can
right.
throw at them. So here in Minnesota, I put Cork into blizzard situations, I think
Oh yeah,
several times, because up here, the winter can kill you if you're not careful.
sure.
In the Levee, it's
It
the
can
river.
kill you pretty quickly.
Yeah, but in terms of that particular event, it really was south of the Ohio River that took it on the chin.
Right.
The what caused the flooding, really, you're right, took place up north in the Ohio River Valley and on the upper Midwest on the Mississippi River, where it rained relentlessly, and it culminated in the flooding that took place then south of that.
You mentioned earlier that that we probably have a cultural memory of this event that still kind of seeps in. The South had you had the Civil War, which
Yeah,
happened, and then Reconstruction, and then you had World War One, that then changed so many families, and then to get hit with something like this,
yeah.
just one devastation after another, just over and over and over. Um, what sorts of sources did you use to really get into the mindset of of how this thing affected the people, and what what that tone should feel like?
Well, I read several news accounts from the day. I read some accounts by first-person accounts by people who had lived along the river at that period of time, and what it did in their lives. But I have to tell you honestly, after I had done my research and looked at the photographs, I just relied on my imagination.
Oh man. So when you finally felt like you could tell this story again, you said that you completely rewrote it.
Yeah.
What does that mean? You hear authors talk about rewriting. So sometimes they mean actually just a heavy edit going through, but or did you start again with the blank page, having the story in your mind that you had already told? But what did that process look like for you?
Well, I have to tell you honestly, I didn't hold on to copies of the stories that I wrote early on. Lost that first piece that I tried many,
Interesting.
many years ago. Lost the story that I wrote when I was in my 40s for the University of Minnesota creative writing class. So when I sat down, I was sitting down writing just as a remembering how I had tried to structure the story and just moving on from there. So essentially, it was a complete, with the exception of the setup for the piece, it was a completely new rewrite of it. I remember the some of the characters. I introduced new characters. I sketched out some of the characters that I had only given, sort of glancing notice in the earlier versions, and I lengthened it by adding a significant event in the middle of the story that that doesn't alter anything, but certainly adds to the fun of everything.
Right, right.
And I rethought significantly the ending. How did I really want this piece to come together in the end? What was the feeling I wanted the reader as they're floating down the river with our characters at the end? What did I want the reader to be feeling at that point?
Well, not to give away the ending because I don't want you to give away the ending, but did you come up with a different culmination of the story from what you were thinking all those years ago? That like, did your place in life now dictate that did you feel like I'm capable of conveying this emotion properly now, or did your ending represent something different now than it would have back then?
I think it probably I've become a more compassionate human being across my life.
You didn't feel the need to torture your characters the way you used to?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you look at my Cork O'Connor series, fewer people die these days in my stories. Um, and I think I have a mission in my work these days. I want to write stories that, in the end, are about hope, about survival, about people overcoming the odds against them, people achieving a place of compassion and forgiveness. And I think I found that in this story. But you wouldn't have found it in either of the two earlier versions. Things
Yeah.
just happened, and that's just all there was to it. And now it was like, no, it's not just things happen, they affect people. There
Right.
is there's a there's a journey for these people beyond what
Yeah.
happens in this story. And I wanted to point that direction.
Well, just to give people some context of what we're talking about, uh, the main characters in the book are a set of convicts and a trustee who are sent out to try to help rescue some people, and
A family that the rescuers believe are trapped by the flood and need
right,
rescuing.
and but
Hmm,
the family has
has other
other
plans.
thoughts. Right. I love the idea that you have a group of convicts that set out to do this, noble deed, and I'm air quoting noble deed here. But that immediately sets up. some tension
Yeah.
in the story, but also in the reader, because it makes us confront our prejudices about how we judge people on the surface. And this is something that you've been doing with Cork O'Connor for years and years, and that's, forcing me as a reader to confront my preconceived notions and my prejudices and the things that I bring to the story. And normally by the end of the story, you've made me think differently about something, which is a hallmark of a great writer, is that you have um, lovingly taken me by the hand and brought me to the end of the book as a different person, as a reader. Were Did you have those sort of heady notions going into this book, or was it just a fun, uh, kind of plot device to play with?
Yeah, I try not to go into any book with heady notions. Yeah, that's going to sink your ship right away.
Yeah, yeah.
Mostly I go
It's
into a
fun at the end when you look back and say, "Oh, there, this. I didn't know I was doing that."
well, actually, as I'm going along, I get a suggestion of where I could go that might make it the story richer and maybe a little deeper story.
Yeah,
And so, in this case, for example, in the early days, my characters were just my characters, with the exception of Dobbs, who is pretty much the centerpiece character-wise for the story.
yeah,
The others were just set; they were there to do what they were supposed to do. In this piece, I thought more deeply about these people, and you talk about your preconceived notions about convicts, and so as I thought about these characters, from having listened to the story, the three convicts, although they are all serving time, are serving time for different reasons,
right.
and uh, and they have their own backstories for how that occurred and why that occurred, and how they each one of them has accepted or not their situation.
Yeah. Um, the narrator in this book, J.D. Jackson.
Yeah.
I've heard J.D. narrate a couple of other books, and he always does a phenomenal job and just brings texture and life to a story that is he has such a subtle narration style. Some people are very bombastic, and while JD can definitely bring emotion to it, he does it uh in a very subtle way. And when you listen to it, the listeners, you'll understand what I'm talking about. um but when you're writing, or when you go through the editorial phase and you know that this is going to be an audiobook production. At some point, you knew that this was going to wind up in audio form. Do you start thinking about writing passages that someone is going to perform, uh, as opposed to someone holding the book and flipping pages? Does that come into your creative process at all?
Well, think about it, Hank. For millennia, storytelling was an oral tradition.
Right.
So as I write, I am speaking the words to myself and sometimes out loud. My wife thinks I'm crazy sometimes because I'm sitting at her typewriter and my mouth's moving along with my fingers. Um, and so I'm very conscious of how the story sounds, how
Yeah.
the cadence, whether I've created cadences that are pleasing. Um, but I have to tell you, my editor at Simon and Schuster, my audiobook editor, who's been doing this work for a very long time, had some wonderful suggestions in terms of altering the text a bit to make it more accessible or for the reader to hear. How I introduced characters, for example, those kinds of things. She was just very helpful in terms of crafting this piece a bit more for a listening audience.
Well, I absolutely love this book. Do you think that you'll ever return to the scene of the crime, as it were, and tell other stories here? I would love for you to. I don't know if you have any ideas or not.
Well, I have a couple of other novellas that I wrote during the pandemic. We'll see how this one does, and then we'll see what might happen down the road. But I have to tell you, Hank, if you look at The Levee, if you look at Ordinary Grace, if you look at This Tender Land, and I have a new standalone coming out this fall called The River We Remember, they are all set in the past. I become more and more enamored of writing stories set in the past for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. What's the main reason? Why do you think it's is it easier to tell those stories? Does it seem to be a richer tapestry that you can paint? What is it about writing in the past, do you think?
Well, if you write crime stories, contemporary crime stories, you have to keep up with all the technology as it develops
Lord,
in
yes,
contemporary
yes.
crime investigation. And boy, there's so much happening. That's just very difficult to do.
So many crime stories would unravel if they could just pull out their cell phone and send
Yeah,
a text message.
you have to be very careful. I like writing about the past because things are already set in place,
Yeah.
and so I can construct a story around what already exists, and I don't have to worry about being completely wrong because wait a minute, the technology has changed.
I love it. The Levy is out everywhere now. You can grab it audiobook format. This is an audiobook original. We'll put a link in the show notes where you can go over to Audible and grab it. The Levy, William Kent Krueger. Kent, this has been so much fun catching up. Please come back this fall and let's talk about your new book then.
I'm all yours, Hank.
Excellent.